Hi guys, welcome to the Aspie Mama. I'm Danny. This channel is about raising kids on the autism spectrum, DIY tutorials, and our life in general. I'll share with you my top tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow our journey. In today's video, I'm going to discuss our autism diagnosis story and how our second child was diagnosed with autism. Coming up. So with each kid that's diagnosed, each kid presents differently. They have their own signs and symptoms. That's why it's called the autism spectrum. Everyone presents in different ways. You can have, one kid can be one way and one can be another way. And our kids are a perfect example of that. My eldest was a typical textbook straightforward diagnosis. And my second son was a complicated hot mess in comparison. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of patience. And it took really just the persistence of me being like, something's not right. Like, let's figure this out. Like, I don't care if it's autism. I don't care if it's something else. Let's just get to the bottom of this. And I think that's ultimately why we were able to get him a diagnosis. I think if we hadn't had been like pushing for him and fighting for him, I don't know if he would have gotten the help that he got in the end. So with Dovey, we always knew from a baby that he probably was ADHD. I remember from the time that I was pregnant, him just moving chaotically in my stomach, especially when like I would lay on my side and it would squish him, he would just go nuts. And even to his birth and the way that he came out in a rush, and also like as a small baby, a few days old, he was rolling over, and from that he just kept going. He was always moving, he was always going. You had to be on your toes with him. You could not rest. It was like Dovey is on the go. He started rolling from a few days old, and then he was crawling by 4 months old. He was cruising shortly after that. Basically, once he learned how to crawl, he learned how to sit, and then from sitting he was climbing, and then from climbing he was standing, and he was walking by 12 months for sure. I was actually surprised because he was cruising quite early, but it took him a while to actually walk by himself. He would like hold and push onto a lot of things, but until he actually free walked was actually closer to a year. But he was up and going for a long time. So everything with him, besides for the movement and ADHD type behavior, seemed fairly normal. And I mean, to us, for us, I mean, we had the child who wasn't typical before that, but what we knew as to be normal, and he seemed like he was on track. His speech we were a little bit more aware of because of our eldest having issues, but our eldest was only diagnosed with autism about the time that we started looking. They're only a year apart, my oldest two boys. My eldest is 13 months older than my second, so they're very close in age. So when Avadia was diagnosed at 3.5, Dovey was only 2.5, and at 2.5 he was starting school, and so we were basically starting the whole process over again. So I mean, it's like we literally got one kid going, and then it was time to move on to the next one. So it was a bit of a whirlwind. So we were checking his speech. He seemed like up until 2.5 his speech was developing. He seemed to talk. He was definitely talking and making words and eye contact and stuff where Avadia hadn't. And he seemed like it was progressing. And then suddenly at 2.5, I don't know what happened, but there definitely was like a plateau and then a regression. It was like the speech just didn't continue to develop. And it was like it was there. He knew the words and he knew how to use them, but it was almost like he chose not to. It was just almost like, I guess, a level of mutism or something. It was just like he didn't want to use speech. He'd rather not speak. He would do anything possible. He would point or just go and take something himself so that he didn't have to ask. He like didn't want to use vocabulary, basically. So the biggest things we noticed with him was the speech regression. He had major issues with lack of fear, which basically meant danger to himself. He would jump off of things forcefully. He would jump from high things. He would, if I took him to the playground, he would, I didn't know if he was gonna try to jump out of like a ladder where you climb up to a tall slide. Crazy things that most kids would be afraid to do, he would do. And then, so when we started the evaluation process with him, it was the same as with our eldest. We went to our pediatrician, we told her what was going on. We felt like we should start the process with him because of his eldest brother being diagnosed, and we just seemed like there was some behavioral issues we wanted to get checked out, and she agreed. So we got the paperwork, we submitted it, we had the meeting with the social worker, answered a bunch of questions, and then we had the appointment. And again, it was with the developmental doctor, social worker, occupational therapist, and psychologist. And in his appointment, it basically, they did everything the same, did the same evaluations, they knew the family history, but they came to the conclusion that he had severe ADHD. It was just like the ADHD was in their face, and that's what they saw, and they didn't see anything else. And the reason why I feel like they didn't see the autism things is, especially at that age, they weren't as obvious. He really kind of had to dig and understand him and know him well, I think, to see them. At that point, his repetitive behaviors, like, he has a STEM, but his STEM hadn't really started at that point. And he was very confusing in the fact that he would make eye contact. The interesting part of that was he would make eye contact with adults, but he would not make eye contact with his peers. He would communicate and interact with adults and get excited to see them, but he would not communicate or interact with his own peers. And even though he was ADHD and he would get hyper, he would not, you know, most hyperactive kids, they might get hyper and play, but he didn't want to play with anyone his own age or anyone around. He didn't want anyone around him. He didn't want anyone touching his things. He didn't want to share. He didn't want to play with them. But when you're in evaluation, it's a room full of adults. So obviously he seemed normal to them when he's in a room full of adults. If you put him in a room full of kids, I think they would have seen something a lot different. Also, just as like we were going through the diagnostic process with him, we had several meetings. I mean, in the initial one, it came out that he was ADHD, and I think we had 3 or 4 follow-ups over the next 2 years. And over the course of those follow-ups, there was a discussion of if he was low cognitive function. They thought maybe, I don't know how, like, another way to say this, but basically they were saying like low cognitive is in some level of retardation. And we're like, that's not possible because he's highly intelligent. He figures out things that most kids his age couldn't figure out how to do. So I don't think that it's an intellectual disability going on here. If anything, it's the opposite. He seems way too smart and way too aware of what's going on, just not able to express himself appropriately. Like when he started preschool, he basically went and found the keys, and he got the keys, and he figured out a way to get up to the door, and he unlocked and unlatched the door of the preschool and was almost out the door when the teacher found him. So I don't think that like, that's not your typical child. Like, that is very smart. And even like as a small child like that at home, we would have to hide things on top of the fridge. We would have to hide things in really weird places, and he would get like a broomstick and like knock something off to get it down, or he would figure out a way to climb up and get it. I mean, just his problem solving skills were off the charts for his age, like just not normal. So that's why we were like, no, I don't think that's a possibility. And then we just kept pointing out, you know, like, okay, he makes eye contact with adults, but like, just because a kid has ADHD doesn't mean that they don't play with their peers. He's not interested in his peers. He hides from them. He actually goes away from them and will hide under items to be away from them. Like, that's not normal behavior. And so the developmental pediatrician heard us, and he kind of felt conflicted and confused as well because the information just was kind of confusing. And so he referred us to a pediatric psychiatrist that was the head of a local hospital. And we had a meeting with her, and we took him along because he was for the evaluation. And we brought along our younger daughter, who was like a baby at the time. It was Haleli, who's now 6. She was probably close to 1 by the time we did this. Maybe, yeah, I think it was 1 actually. She must have been around 1 or just a little bit less than 1. But we took her along, and it's like, he's having his evaluation, she's asking us questions, and then she's watching him play, and then she sees how he's not interacting with his sister. His sister's like trying to play with him and do things, and he's like not responding. He's not, and from that it gave her the clarity of like, yeah, there's definitely something, communication disorder going on. And through her we were able to get the autism diagnosis. Where we live, you need two people to agree on the diagnosis. You need a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, a child psychologist, a child neurologist, or a developmental pediatrician, but you need 2 of those in order to get the diagnosis official, that it's recognized by the government, and that you can get assistance and benefits. So for us, that was the case. So we had 1 of the 2 that we needed, and then it was like, okay, who are we gonna go to for the second? Because the original psychologist that saw him did not agree with autism at all. She felt like no. So now we have this like renowned lady who people respect saying yes, so that gave us a little bit of credibility. And then they referred us back to our insurance, and within our insurance, within our insurance company, our developmental pediatrician referred us to a different psychologist that he worked with sometimes, and we met with her, and she saw him and she evaluated him and she agreed with the diagnosis. So and we got 2 signatures for him of in agreement that he was on the autism spectrum disorder, but that took us 2 years of questioning, pushing, trying, and finally we got it. So we were just so relieved to have an answer for him and know that we could get help for him and help him move forward, because we just felt like we were spinning wheels in mud at that point. Like we just couldn't get anything accomplished because we just didn't know what we were doing. Like we didn't have a name, we didn't know what we were doing, we just knew something wasn't right, and we were starting to feel more and more that it was autism, but then we felt like we were crazy because no one would hear it. I mean, they kind of heard it, but they just didn't really feel like that was it, but ultimately that's kind of where it led them. So we were just happy in the end to have that diagnosis, even though we knew, you know, what that could mean for him long term. For us, you know, it's still the loss of like, whatever. It's, we were just happy to have a diagnosis for him and to know where to go forward from that. So that was a big sigh of relief for us. But that's pretty much his general story from diagnosis to now. And you know, it's a journey. That's why I call it a journey. It's a journey, and it's ups and downs like a roller coaster, but you're on the ride and you ain't getting off in the middle. So you just gotta hang on and ride it out, and it'll all sort itself out. So I hope this video helped you guys. If you're struggling and you have a kid who you feel like has autism and you're just not getting the diagnosis, or you're not getting the help, maybe just try to rethink things, see if there's someone else that they could see, I guess. If that's not working, then maybe just put a pause on it and just focus on, maybe if you're able to financially, to give that, see if you can just get them some outside treatment that you feel like might help them in whatever way that they're struggling. And I think eventually all will come out in the wash. So if you just have patience, everything will kind of eventually work itself out. Especially with kids with autism, the older they get, whether it's a girl or a boy, there's a certain point where it just becomes obvious that those are the issues, even if it takes a lot longer, maybe because they're higher functioning or they're masking it better. It always kind of comes out in the end. So just be patient, do your best as a parent, you know, love your child, give them positivity, encouragement, and just keep on being that mama bear. Question of the day: if you have a child and you have a certain religious belief, but they have developmental needs, would you choose a school that only supports the developmental needs, or send them to a religious school and try to do the developmental needs outside? I'm curious what you guys think about that. Be sure to leave your comments below, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.